Okay, so yeah, hi everyone. So my name's Rose Island. I'll do a little bit of background on me just so you know who I am. So I started working in cyber in probably about 2017. So all of my experience to date has really been very centric around security operations centers. I started as an analyst. I've worked in a few different SOCs. I've worked my way up to kind of senior analyst through to SOC engineer. I ended up like leading the engineering team at IBM for their UK SOC. And then I decided to take a sidestep outside of kind of the operations environment into consulting, which is what I'm doing at the moment. And I'm working now with Hippo Digital's customers to help them with their SIEM onboarding. So all of my experience to date has basically been in and around SIEMs, hence the topic of this talk. And basically, I mean, I've seen a lot of the same mistakes happening in a lot of different SOCs I've worked in for a lot of different customers. This isn't only relevant to SOCs. I mean, any kind of smaller business that's looking to bring in cybersecurity, anyone that basically wants some level of protective monitoring. I'd hope that the ideas from this remain relevant and you could help implement that with third-party suppliers or anyone that you were looking to talk with. So hopefully this is kind of useful and relevant. But yeah, the purpose of this talk is around why taking a use case-led approach to SIEM onboarding is important. And so we're going to talk about, I don't want to teach anyone to suck eggs, but I'm going to start really basic with what's the difference between a use case and a detection rule, because I hear them get used interchangeably quite a lot in the industry. And I've certainly come across a lot of people who are confused about the difference. So I feel like it's good to just start with that. Then I'll talk about why it's important and what a use case-led approach is, talk about the benefits and the drawbacks, and then I'm going to talk about the kind of two-pronged approach that we've developed over at Hippo, which I think is super useful for basically anybody doing this. And then that'll be about it. So yeah, let's make a start. So use cases and detection rules, like I said, the two terms get used somewhat interchangeably. But they are distinct while still related. So use case you can think of as basically kind of the why. It's the high level argument for why you might want to bring data into your SIEM tool. Um, and then the detection rule is the how. It's how specifically are we going to configure our logic to look for this scenario that we've set out. So an example might be your use case is you want to identify unauthorized access to critical servers within your infrastructure. And then the detection rule is the logic within the SIEM that says, okay, send me an alert if I've had multiple failed login attempts, followed by a successful attempt on this set of critical servers within X minutes. Something to note is that a use case can have multiple different detection rules to fulfill it. So you might find that different data sources or parts of your environment would require slightly different logic to fulfill that same use case. So you might have, one or six or more use detection rules required to fill that use case. But another important thing in terms of SIEM onboarding is the use case doesn't actually have to be fulfilled by a detection rule at all. Something like a use case of contextual information for analysts, it is just as valid. Some data sources, like for example, firewalls, you can write some detections for them, but in general, they're the most useful for providing insight to the analysts in their investigations of other alerts because they provide kind of um, a sort of log of where actors' IPs and things have come into the system. So it's often more useful that type of logging during investigations rather than for detection logic specifically, and that's a valid reason to bring it into your SIEM. So moving on, so what do I mean by use case led approach? It's very simple, and it's literally what it says on the right there. You don't ever bring data into your SIEM without a valid use case. And this basically means that your security assessment needs to come at the very beginning of your onboarding journey. Quite often you see it coming in at the end. Data is often onboarded first, and then the use cases are considered, which means your SIEM can get like very bloated and expensive to run. So our idea is to do the security assessment up front, then do your data onboarding, then do your kind of normalization and engineering, and finally your content creation. So I'm going to go through a little bit of the kind of benefits of this approach. So on the left there, the data-driven approach is what I've called kind of what I've seen generally happening with SIEM onboarding. And then on the right is the approach that I'm talking about today. So the way it's normally done is, I think, kind of senior management and that type of thing in organizations generally have an approach of what we want. We've bought this magical SIEM tool and we want everything in it as soon as possible. So it's a case of just finding all of the data you can across an organization and throwing it into the SIEM. And I think there's a misunderstanding quite often around where value comes in. And value comes from the use cases and the detection rules being delivered and fulfilled and the data being well parsed. So just putting data into a SIEM tool doesn't really provide you with any value at all. It just costs a lot of money. Generally, ingest costs with a SIEM are very high. Storage costs the same. You can even find some SIEMs like Splunk where the cost of running your detections is also a thing. Like other ones like QRadar, you don't have to pay for that, but with Splunk, it's yeah, the more rules you add kind of ends up increasing the costs. So having kind of a tight use case and detection rule set is really important for some SIEMs, and having the sort of smallest amount of data that you can in order to deliver the use cases and detections that you require is vital for almost any organization to keep their costs acceptable. So if you're onboarding data without having thought about your use cases ahead of time, you will end up with a huge amount of data that is essentially unused and providing no value to your analysts or to any of the detections. You can make the argument that, it's useful for the analysts to just have everything for their investigations, which is true, but the amount of time that that's required versus the amount of cost that's going to, like, that what that will cost the organization, it's not really like a balance that's generally worth it. Also, quite frequently, if you haven't considered your use cases up front, you'll find that you've onboarded kind of whatever the admin of that device wants to log to you, which isn't necessarily the security relevant data from that device. And again, if you're doing sort of retrospective evaluations of data of what you've got in the SIEM to develop your use cases, you find that you might not notice that you're missing the important data. Whoever's looking at the data and writing the use cases might well just think, oh, this is all we can get from this device. And then the detections aren't very good off the back of it. So you can miss really important stuff. And the final point on sort of drawbacks for data-driven approach is that once data is in a SIEM, in my experience, it's very, very difficult to make the argument to get rid of it. So once you've onboarded too much, you're kind of stuck with it. Nobody in an operational environment has the time or wherewithal to put together these arguments to get rid of it again. So it's better just not to bring it in the first place. So that's why we advocate for this use case led approach where before you bring any data in, you spend the time upfront and say, okay, what do we actually want to look for? What do we care about? How will we use this data to fulfill this? And until you've got that justification, you don't do the work. It can be a hard sell to sort of senior management and upper layers who are less sort of technically minded because obviously the way that sounds is we're going to put all this time up front and we're not going to see anything for a long time. Whereas obviously if they're just onboarding data, they feel like they're getting progress. I think it's really important to explain that the progress of onboarding data isn't actually progress in terms of security. So what you want to look at and evaluate is the time between deciding to onboard stuff and actually your detection rules being fulfilled. And with the use case led approach, that is certainly not any longer from those 2 points. It's just it takes longer to get the data to land, but then the use case part is really quick because you've already defined them. And like I said, it means that your costs will be reduced. So particularly for like smaller organizations, that's a huge win. You can afford to run your SIEM on a lower budget, which is a very good thing. It also means that once the data lands, the detection rules can be deployed very quickly. And the other thing is that it generally means that your kind of use case library management, which is another thing, which is a very big problem in SOCs, it is generally higher quality because you're thinking about it upfront, and that means you're generally more conscious of what you've got, how you're going to reuse that across other data sources, that type of thing. So you're able to keep a much tighter and more well-rounded use case set than if you're just sort of trying to retrospectively fit detection rules to data that already exists. Um, so yeah, that's broadly the benefits of it. So like I said, the biggest issue is kind of optics of it. Oh, it can be slow to onboard. So the way that we're approaching this at the moment is kind of a two-pronged onboarding. So we've got this baseline, which to be honest, I think regardless of whether you're taking a use case-led approach, which obviously you should, um, it's worth doing this anyway because it will get you kind of quick, decent coverage across your organization. But what we've defined with our baseline onboarding is essentially we've kind of worked with our customers on what their kind of key concerns are for their organization, and we're aiming with baseline for kind of a broad general coverage of the organization as a whole. So you're looking at sort of the low-hanging fruit, the big hitting use cases. What can I easily detect from data sources that are kind of well known and easy to onboard to provide a kind of reasonable level of coverage? So you're looking at kind of the obvious data sources, stuff like your, AWS CloudTrail, your firewalls, your endpoints, your web servers, that type of thing, to just do a kind of broad-based big hitter approach. And the point of this is, well, twofold. So the first is to try and provide some quicker onboarding because you're looking at this is like a predefined set of use cases that you've created to say, this is what we care about upfront. And with that will come, here are the data sources that fulfill it. And those will be well known and therefore easy to onboard. So this is kind of the quick win onboarding. You can cover your organization very quickly with your baseline. Obviously, though, that's going to have gaps. While you might see someone in your environment, you might miss some key stuff that they're doing on other devices that aren't included. And that's where the enhanced half of this comes in, which is sort of the slower paced but more detailed onboarding. So this is where any sort of data sources or sort of use cases of interest you have that fall outside of your initial baseline kind of chunk are approached a bit more slowly. So this is where you might want to bring in something like threat modeling or sort of a deeper sort of security look at those components and that data and how you can use it. And that can go on kind of during or after the baseline onboarding. So it's kind of this is more your BAU kind of improvement piece, and this is just ongoing. And the pace of this, therefore, is slower because you can be a lot more detailed in your kind of analysis of the different components or whatever it is you're looking at. You can do your threat assessment, you can define your use cases, and then you can say, okay, so this is what we want from this component, therefore we'll bring on this field and that data, that log file from this device and bring it in. So it kind of with baseline, you can please the kind of the stakeholders, like, look, we're getting coverage quickly, and enhance lets you bring on like actually strong coverage across all of your infrastructure. Um, and then kind of as a final point, I just want to cover quickly kind of, this is all nice theoreticals, but how do you actually kind of do these assessments of infrastructure and services? Um, the way we're doing it at the moment at Hippo is sort of we're trying to break down organizations into their kind of different IT environments, and for each environment, we do a security assessment at the start. So that begins with a documentation review. So we'll try and look through all of their technical documentation, their HLDs, their LLDs, that type of thing, understand the service design, get architectural diagrams, and then we'll have various touch points with the kind of technical teams who run those environments to get their perspective on their environment, talk to them about our understanding of their documentation, find gaps. And this is, there are some formal calls. We'll have a formal introductory call. And then after that, it's sort of informal calls and touch points before we do what we call an architectural walkthrough, which is where we run through everything we've learned and provide them our opinion on what we should onboard and through which means of baseline or enhanced. And then when everybody's happy and agreed that that will provide like the correct coverage, then we kind of output a document proposing what we agreed in the walkthrough, which we call the security monitoring proposal. Um, So yeah, I mean that's broadly it. It's all about trying to minimize costs, but also kind of increase. I think you quite often find with SIEM onboarding that you miss, you get stuff onboarded, the documentation isn't there to tell you what was onboarded and why. The use cases are usually not well documented, and you can find down the line in a SOC that you actually don't really understand what you've got in place for each of your clients or services or environments. And it can become really tricky to manage that as you go through. So taking this approach of kind of doing all the work up front to understand what you've got and what you want to implement allows you to write really good documentation, allows you to have a really tight use case library, and therefore means that your SIEM will be a lot easier to manage and it'll be a lot easier to fill gaps as you go through. So yeah, that's the crux of it. So yeah, I'd welcome any questions anybody's got.